No, get away!
Timothy! They're screaming! Oh God, it's the bears!
911, what is your emergency?
They're being attacked, and I can hear it. It's tearing into him.
Stay calm, ma'am. Where are you? We need your exact location.
Katmai National Park. The Grizzlies, please hurry!
What you just heard was not a dramatization, but a real call linked to one of the most shocking wildlife tragedies ever recorded. On a cold October evening in Alaska, Timothy Treadwell, known to some as the Grizzly Man, and his partner Amy Huguenard faced the very fate he had spent years denying: death at the claws and jaws of the animals he loved most. For over a decade, Treadwell lived among grizzly bears, filming them, naming them, and insisting he was safe in their world. To him, they were friends, companions, never predators. But in the end, his belief in harmony collided with the raw law of the wild. This is the story of devotion, obsession, and the thin line between reverence and danger. Subscribe to Animal Shock Stories and share your thoughts in the comments. Were these bears misunderstood, or was Timothy blinded by his faith? These are true stories. Timothy Treadwell emerged in the public eye not as a scientist, not as a rugged hunter or seasoned Alaskan guide, but as something altogether different, a man whose heart seemed to beat in rhythm with the wilderness he adored. He was slender, with a boyish smile that concealed an undercurrent of restlessness, a wanderer who had found his calling in the most dangerous company imaginable, the grizzly bears of Alaska's Katmai National Park. Where others saw hulking masses of muscle and instinct, predators whose size and force could break a human life in an instant, Treadwell insisted he saw personalities, even souls. He gave the bears names Mr. Chocolate, Mickey, Downy, and spoke of them with affection, as if they were companions rather than wild carnivores. Over the years, his self-fashioned mission grew into something larger than mere fascination. He would live among them, document them, and protect them from the unseen dangers of poachers and encroachment. He set up his camera in the meadows and along riverbanks, capturing footage of them fishing for salmon, sparring with rivals, or dozing in the sun, and in those frames, he did not stand as a distant observer, but as a part of their world. To many, it seemed madness, an outsider stepping uninvited into the domain of creatures that had never been tamed, but to Timothy, it was a life's purpose. He wanted to show the world that the grizzlies were not monsters lurking in the shadows, but powerful, noble beings worthy of awe and respect. His voice in interviews carried both urgency and tenderness. He spoke of defending them with a near messianic conviction, telling anyone who would listen that he alone was willing to cross the line between human and beast to prove harmony was possible. In Katmai, he found something he felt the civilized world had denied him: a place of raw truth, a home where the masks of society fell away. He endured bitter cold, swarms of insects, and the gnawing isolation of months in the wilderness, yet his lens was always trained outward, onto the creatures that defined his days and nights. His tapes and journals painted him as both a guardian and a prophet, a man who stood on the fragile edge between devotion and obsession. With each summer he returned, his bond with the bears grew tighter, his belief in his safety more unshakable, until he could not imagine a life away from them. In his mind, the bears were not simply animals. They were his family, his salvation, perhaps even the answer to a longing he could not name. But beneath the reverent beauty of his mission, there lingered an unspoken truth, that no matter how gentle his words, no matter how affectionate his gaze, Timothy Treadwell was living inside the hunting grounds of one of nature's most formidable predators, and the line between love and peril was thinner than he dared to admit. Timothy Treadwell's philosophy was as radical as it was romantic. In his eyes, grizzly bears were not killers, not the hulking predators that survival manuals and biologists warned people about, but misunderstood companions, exiled by fear into the role of monsters. In his recorded footage, he can be seen crouching in the tall grass, whispering to them as though speaking to trusted confidants. His words were gentle, even affectionate. He called out to them by the names he had chosen, soft syllables meant to erase the distance between man and beast. "Hello, Mr. Chocolate," he would murmur, his camera capturing the shadow of a massive bear rising on its hind legs in the distance. To Timothy, this was no threat, but a greeting, a gesture of curiosity from a friend. He waved, grinned, and spoke of trust, declaring to his unseen audience that these bears knew him, accepted him, even loved him. Again and again, he refused to acknowledge the warnings layered in the natural order. The rippling muscles, the claws that could flay a body open in a single strike, the unpredictable hunger that surged with each passing season. He insisted that love and respect, freely given, could override instinct, that his presence among them was not an intrusion, but a covenant. In reenacted moments from his tapes, he is seen touching the ground where their tracks lay, his fingers brushing the impressions in the soil as if they were sacred symbols. He spoke of the bears as noble, almost divine beings, embodiments of beauty rather than violence. For him, every growl was a language to decipher, every glance an affirmation that his theory was right, that humanity could exist in peace with apex predators. Yet, within these tender exchanges, an ominous tension simmered. His insistence on ignoring their primal nature blurred the critical lines between wonder and danger, between reverence and denial. The camera recorded his laughter when a bear approached too close, his soothing voice urging it to calm down, as if words could disarm instinct. He told his viewers that the grizzlies protected him, that they recognized him as one of their own, and in these statements lay a perilous hubris. The very philosophy that set him apart, that made his mission so extraordinary, also laid the foundation for tragedy. He was dismantling the invisible fence that every other human respected, the boundary that said these creatures are wild and their world is not ours. It was a beautiful illusion, intoxicating in its optimism, yet dangerous in its blindness, for in the wilderness, even beauty carries teeth and claws. And though Timothy could not yet see it, the cracks in his philosophy had already begun to spread, foreshadowing the moment when devotion would no longer shield him from the reality he had chosen not to believe. Alaska's Katmai National Park is not a backdrop of postcard beauty alone. It is a vast and untamed wilderness, a place where nature reveals itself in its most unforgiving forms. Stretching across millions of acres of volcanic mountains, glacial rivers, and wind-swept tundra, it is a land defined by extremes, ferocious storms that sweep in without warning, winters that bury the landscape in darkness and ice, and summers that unleash swarms of biting insects and floods of melting snow. At its heart lies the rhythm of the grizzly bears, rulers of this domain, whose survival is dictated by the shifting abundance of the seasons. In early summer, they gorge on sedges and berries. As salmon fill the rivers, they gather at the banks, their massive forms silhouetted against the currents as they snatch fish with terrifying precision. Yet when the salmon runs dwindle and autumn deepens, hunger gnaws at them, and their temperaments shift. Once indifferent, even lazy in the richness of midsummer, they become restless, prowling for food to carry them into the long hibernation ahead. It is a cycle as old as the land itself, a brutal clock that governs the life and death of everything within Katmai's borders. Against this backdrop of raw survival, Timothy Treadwell's vision of harmony appears almost otherworldly. He saw Katmai as a sanctuary, a cathedral of wild beauty where man could walk unarmed among predators, guided only by reverence and trust. His camera framed the bears in golden light, their fur glistening with river water, their faces softened by his words of affection. But outside the lens, the truth was starker. These were not companions or guardians. They were creatures honed by necessity, driven by instinct, indifferent to human presence, except as potential threat or opportunity. In Katmai, there are no illusions, no safety nets. The law is survival, and it is written in claw marks on trees, in the carcasses left along riverbanks, in the sudden roar of a territorial challenge that echoes across the valley. For all his devotion, Timothy was a solitary figure, trying to bend that law into something it could never be. Where Katmai stripped everything down to its essentials: eat, endure, dominate, Timothy layered on human longing, painting a picture of communion that denied the harsher truths. The park itself stood as a silent witness, its vastness echoing the indifference of nature. It would not bend to his ideals, nor soften to his presence. And within its isolation, cut off from human rescue or interference, the stage was set for a clash between one man's romantic faith and the unyielding reality of the wilderness he had chosen to call home. The summer of 2003 was supposed to end like the others, with Timothy Treadwell and Amy Huguenard boarding a plane out of Katmai before the weather turned and the bears shifted into their final frenzy of feeding. But instead, they lingered, convinced their time in the wilderness was not yet complete. For 13 seasons, Timothy had returned, and this one felt different, perhaps more urgent, as though he had something left to prove, a message not yet fully delivered. Amy, quieter, more cautious by nature, followed his lead with a kind of uneasy loyalty, her trust in him outweighing her fear of the shadows that seemed to grow longer with each passing day. The park was changing, subtly at first, winds colder, rains heavier, the vibrant greens of summer dulling into the muted hues of autumn. The salmon runs that had filled the rivers began to thin, and with scarcity came agitation. The bears, once almost languid in their abundance, became restless, their movements sharper, their presence closer. Locals and bush pilots warned him not to linger, their words edged with the blunt pragmatism of those who knew Katmai's unforgiving temperament. "The bears are different now, Tim," one pilot told him. "They're hungry, and hungry bears are dangerous." But Timothy dismissed the caution, interpreting it as fear born from misunderstanding, the very misunderstanding he had spent his life trying to correct. He saw himself as their protector, their friend, the bridge between humanity and the wild. Amy, however, could not shake the unease. She felt it in the air, in the way the silence of the camp was broken by sudden, heavy steps outside the tent at night, in the dark eyes that watched from the tree line longer than before. There was a heaviness to the days, as though the wilderness itself was pressing down, a warning unspoken, yet undeniable. Symbolically, the shadow of winter advanced, not only in the encroaching storms, but in the inevitability of the cycle Timothy refused to acknowledge. In pushing past the natural end of their season, they had crossed an invisible threshold, placing themselves in a time of hunger, a season when the boundaries between man and predator thinned to a breaking point. Timothy's optimism framed it as devotion, staying longer to ensure the bears' safety. But in truth, it was the convergence of his ideals with nature's harshest reality. Amy's silence grew heavier, her compliance laced with fear, and yet she remained, bound to him by love, loyalty, and the quiet hope that his belief might somehow hold. But Katmai does not bend to hope. As October darkened the skies and the winds howled through the valleys, the stage was set for the last chapter of Timothy Treadwell's wilderness journey, a chapter not written in soft words of love for the bears, but in the unforgiving script of hunger, instinct, and survival. Each day in Katmai unfolded like a strange blend of wilderness documentary and personal diary, with Timothy Treadwell at its center, weaving himself into a life that blurred the line between human and beast. He would rise in the early hours, the fog still draped over the valleys, and step out of his tent barefoot, his camera already in hand, speaking softly into the lens as though confessing secrets to a trusted friend. His words were often tender, reverent, filled with awe at the sight of a massive grizzly lumbering past his camp. "Hello, Mr. Chocolate," he whispered once, his voice trembling not with fear but with what sounded like affection as the giant bear turned its massive head toward him. He spoke to them as if they were children, offering greetings, pleasantries, even reassurances, though the bears never answered except with the guttural sounds of their kind snorts, low rumbles, the snap of jaws. These moments were caught on tape, framed by Timothy as proof that his philosophy was working, that his presence was not intrusion, but communion. And yet, beneath the beauty of the images, fur glistening with river water, claws sinking into salmon, sunlight gilding their backs. There was a quiet unease, a reminder that what appeared to be trust might only be tolerance born of abundance. His calm demeanor in the face of such raw power was courageous to some, but to others, it seemed frighteningly naive, a performance of control in a place where control belonged to the wild. Amy watched him closely, her silence often betraying worry, her body stiff when bears lingered too close to their tent. Timothy brushed her fears aside with a gentle hand and a soothing voice, promising that respect would keep them safe, that his role as their guardian was mutual, that they knew he was there to protect them, and so they, in turn, would protect him. It was a belief that carried both poetry and peril. To the camera, his devotion painted a picture of transcendence. A man who had stepped outside human society to live among creatures revered as gods by ancient cultures. But the narration of his life also revealed a darker truth, that love, untempered by caution, can slip into denial. Every time he extended his hand toward the shadow of a bear passing by, every time he crouched low in the grass to whisper a name into the void, the balance tilted further toward danger. His days were filled with simple tasks, patching tents, boiling water, writing in journals, but each was interrupted by the presence of giants, their looming figures reminding him of the risk he had chosen to ignore. For Timothy, these were not warnings but blessings, affirmations of his belonging. Yet, in every glance from those dark, inscrutable eyes, the wilderness wrote a different story, one of patience running thin, of instinct unbound, of devotion daring the edge of disaster. The signs began quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, like cracks forming beneath the surface of ice. The bears that once lingered at a distance now approached closer, their movements sharper, less languid than the days of salmon-filled abundance. The runs were dwindling, the rivers thinning of fish, and with scarcity came a restless energy that charged the air around the camp. At night, Timothy and Amy would hear heavy footsteps pressing through the damp earth just beyond the tent, the sharp exhale of a bear's breath carried into the silence. In daylight, massive bodies would emerge suddenly from the tree line, not with curiosity but with a pressing urgency, their eyes glinting with a hunger that made every encounter unpredictable. For Amy, each moment carried a weight of dread. She watched Timothy stand before the animals with his calm voice and outstretched arms, offering greetings as though ritual could soften instinct. Her heart pounded as one bear lingered too long, its ears angled forward, its bulk swaying with indecision, and still Timothy whispered words of endearment, certain his presence was shield enough. "They know me," he insisted, brushing away her whispered warnings. "They trust me." Yet trust was a human word, a human desire, and in the eyes of the bears there was no recognition of covenant, only instinct tempered by the constant calculation of hunger. Amy's unease deepened with each passing hour, her silence breaking into sharp pleas that he take caution, that they leave before the tension snapped. But Timothy's conviction only grew stronger, hardening into defiance against the very fear she felt. He framed the closeness of the bears as a triumph, proof that he had crossed the invisible threshold of acceptance. What to Amy was danger, to him was affirmation. The emotional tension between them became a quiet battle, the unease of a woman who sensed the looming peril, and the obsession of a man who refused to surrender his dream even when shadows darkened the edges. At night, she lay awake, clutching the thin fabric of the tent as if it could protect them, listening to the shifting bodies outside, her breaths shallow with dread. Timothy, on the other hand, often spoke of destiny, of his role as a guardian chosen to stand between the wild and the world that misunderstood it. The contrast was stark. Her fear painted every rustle of leaves as a warning, his devotion cast every growl as a blessing. Between them, love tethered two opposing truths, the human instinct to survive and the human yearning to belong. In that fragile space of tension, the wilderness waited, patient and merciless, as the balance tilted toward the inevitable. The night before the attack unfolded like a haunting prelude. A fragile calm stretched thin over the gathering storm. Timothy sat close to the campfire, its orange light flickering against his face as he spoke in low, reverent tones about destiny, about how his life had finally found its purpose here among the bears. His words carried the weight of conviction, shaped not by doubt but by a certainty that he was meant to be in this place, that his bond with the wilderness was not only real but sacred. Amy sat opposite him, her silence heavier than the crackling fire between them. She listened, her eyes fixed on the flames, yet her body was rigid, her shoulders tense with the quiet burden of fear she dared not fully voice. Overhead, the sky churned with restless clouds, the first threads of a storm rolling in, winds sweeping down through the valley with sudden force that rattled their tents and sent sparks from the fire into the darkness. It was, in every sense, a storm not of weather alone, but of fate closing in. Around them, unseen but unmistakable, came the sounds of massive bodies circling just beyond the veil of night. The snap of twigs under great weight, the deep rumble of exhaled breath carried on the wind. Timothy tilted his head toward the noises with a kind of wonder, whispering to Amy that their guardians had come to watch over them. For her, the sounds were no guardians but omens, the steady orbit of predators measuring the fragile boundary between curiosity and hunger. The fire dwindled to embers as the hours deepened, shadows stretching longer across their camp, the air thick with tension neither of them could name aloud. In the stillness between gusts, there was a silence so heavy it pressed into the chest, followed by the sudden, deliberate crack of branches underfoot. Timothy smiled faintly, as if reassured by their presence, while Amy drew her knees closer to her chest, the dread settling over her like the cold night air. The wind keened against the fabric of their tent when at last they lay down, the walls trembling as if warning of what loomed just beyond. Sleep came fitfully, broken by the shifting groans of the storm and the steady pacing of unseen bears, their presence as constant as the thunder rolling through the mountains. In that narrow, suspended space between night and dawn, devotion and denial, the stage was set. The wilderness had closed its circle, and within it, two human lives waited on the edge of destiny, unaware of how swiftly the storm would break. It began with a sound that split the night open, the violent tearing of fabric as a massive grizzly ripped through the thin skin of the tent, shattering the fragile boundary between safety and the wild. In an instant, the world inside dissolved into chaos. Timothy's voice rose first, shouting in desperation, not words of fear but cries that mixed command with pleading, a man trying to call back the fragile covenant he believed had protected him for so long. The bear's shadow filled the space, its weight collapsing the tent poles, its bulk blotting out the dim light of the storm-streaked sky. Amy's scream pierced through the roar of wind and the guttural growls, her terror raw and unrestrained as she scrambled in the darkness for escape, for anything that could shield them. But there was no shield, only the primal force of the bear, a beast driven by hunger and instinct, overwhelming every fragile barrier of human fragility. Timothy's cries turned frantic, his voice cracking as he thrashed against the sudden weight pressing down, the air thick with the smell of earth and wet fur. The grizzly's power was not subtle. It was violent, crushing, the strike of claws and the grind of teeth against flesh, each movement a reminder of how little humanity mattered in this place. The tent collapsed fully, canvas and poles folding around them like a shroud, muffling Amy's sobs as she shouted Timothy's name again and again, her terror rising above the storm. The night was no longer defined by wind or thunder, but by the raw symphony of violence, the tearing, the cries, the guttural rumble of a predator claiming its due. It was a scene of pure inevitability, the fragile illusion of harmony disintegrating in seconds under the weight of nature's law. No reverence, no philosophy, no whispered names could stop the truth. The wilderness does not remember promises, and devotion cannot tame hunger. What had begun as trust ended in an eruption of force, and within that chaos, two lives were caught in the merciless jaws of reality. The struggle unfolded in darkness, a desperate blur of motion and sound that would later be immortalized only in audio, the tape capturing the raw final moments of Timothy Treadwell's life. His cries filled the air, first defiant, then pleading, as the bear dragged him down into the sodden earth. The sounds were guttural, ragged, his voice breaking beneath the weight of pain as claws and teeth tore into him with merciless precision. Amy's desperate screams rose above it, a voice of terror and futility, calling his name again and again as though the force of her words could pull him back from the predator's grasp. She struck at the bear with anything she could grasp, pots, pans, her bare hands each blow a hopeless defiance against the unstoppable. The chaos was overwhelming. The slap of heavy paws, the churn of earth beneath massive weight, the roar of the storm above, mixing with the guttural growls of the animal as it asserted dominance in a battle that was never a battle at all. Only the enactment of nature's inevitability. The ground itself seemed to heave under the violence, waterlogged soil splashing as the bear dragged Timothy further, his voice fading into hoarse, broken gasps. Amy's cries became frantic, sharp bursts of terror and grief, her breath catching as she fought with the desperation of someone who knew the odds yet refused to yield. The audio would later reveal her final pleas, her voice high and cracking, telling him to play dead, to hang on, to fight, even as the sounds of struggle dwindled into silence. Every moment carried the stark clash between human devotion and natural inevitability, chaos and order entwined into a single, brutal truth. The wilderness had spoken with claws and jaws, and in that dreadful entanglement of storm, soil, and screams, the illusion of harmony was torn apart, leaving behind only the raw, merciless reality of predator and prey. When the violence ended, the silence that followed was almost unbearable, broken only by the low howl of the storm still sweeping through the valley. The cries were gone, the sounds of struggle extinguished, leaving the wilderness once again to its own rhythms. The fire had long since been smothered by wind and rain, the tent reduced to torn scraps pressed into the mud, and the ground itself bore the heavy imprints of a struggle that was over before it could truly begin. For hours the storm raged on, carrying with it an eerie stillness that seemed to swallow the echoes of what had happened. When rangers eventually arrived the next day, summoned by the desperate witness and the sudden absence of Timothy's voice on the radio, they found only fragments of what had once been 2 human lives. Scattered belongings, a collapsed campsite, and the unmistakable evidence of a bear's claim. They tracked the massive animal still circling nearby, its fur matted, its body heavy with the remains of what it had taken. Yet when they finally subdued it, the bear was not raging, not snarling with defiance, but eerily calm, its dark eyes blank, indifferent, as if the violence it had unleashed was nothing more than instinct carried out without malice or memory. In that chilling stillness lay the harshest truth of all. The wilderness does not grieve, does not reckon with morality, does not bear the weight of tragedy. It endures, as it always has, unmoved by human ideals of love or reverence. Timothy's devotion, Amy's loyalty, their final cries, these were threads of human meaning cast into a vast and indifferent tapestry. The storm passed, the skies cleared, and Katmai remained unchanged, its rivers still running, its mountains still looming, and its grizzlies still circling, indifferent witnesses to a tragedy that had been inevitable from the moment one man believed he could stand unarmed in the kingdom of predators. In the aftermath of Katmai's silence, a haunting question lingers, one that cannot be answered with certainty. Did Timothy Treadwell truly honor the bears he loved, or did he fatally misunderstand them, blinded by a devotion that could not bridge the gap between predator and man? His life was framed as a testimony to passion, to the belief that love and respect could dissolve the barrier of fear. Yet his death serves as the starkest reminder of nature's unyielding laws. Was he a martyr to a noble cause, or a dreamer consumed by the very wilderness he sought to protect? The truth, perhaps, lies in the tension between those two visions, a space where reverence and denial intertwine. Amy's fate bound her to his conviction, her silence through the long nights, and her final cries standing as an echo of his devotion and its cost. Together, they became part of Katmai's story, not as conquerors or guardians, but as fragile figures swept into the rhythm of survival that has defined this land for centuries. There is tragedy here, but also a strange symmetry. For in the end, both man and beast were bound in inevitability, neither villain, neither savior, only players in a cycle far older than human longing. The bears of Katmai continued on, their hunger undiminished, their presence unsoftened by the loss of one who tried to live among them. And so the story closes not with blame, but with a sobering truth. The wilderness does not bend to love, it only endures.